Sometime after 4 p.m., Michelle and Joe enter Wayne and Judy's house, armed with a .357 revolver and a 9mm handgun.
Can you imagine that you're sitting in your home on Christmas, laughing and celebrating with your loved ones, and all of a sudden one of your loved ones barges in and opens fire? It is hard to imagine anything more senseless or tragic, but for several families over the years, this was their reality.
It happened at her family's home in Covina, when her aunt's ex-husband, dressed as Santa Claus and armed with 4 semi-automatic weapons, began shooting before setting the home on fire, killing 9 of her family members.
These are 3 shocking and unspeakable Christmas family massacres that are sure to leave you speechless. The Covina Massacre. It was December 24th of 2008, and in Covina, California, the Ortega family was joined together to celebrate. But the home that was then filled with laughter, warmth, and joy would soon transform into a place filled with complete and utter terror and tragedy. It would take just one moment and one horrific act of violence for the Ortega family's happiness to be shattered, and for life as they knew it to be changed forever. The night began with the Ortega family hosting their yearly Christmas party. Their home was bustling with people, all enjoying the festivities. The youngest of the bunch were playing outside near the family pool, while some of the teenagers played on their computers upstairs. Meanwhile, the adults were enjoying each other's company in the family room. Everything was going as planned, until suddenly there was a knock at the door. The family hadn't been expecting any other visitors at their home that evening. But as soon as one of the children, an 8-year-old girl, heard the knock, she immediately assumed that it was Santa Claus arriving to bring them their presents. She rushed to the door to answer, and sure enough, there was a man dressed like Santa Claus, standing there on the doorstep. Unfortunately, he wasn't holding gifts, but instead was carrying a firearm. That man, who was later revealed as 45-year-old Bruce Jeffrey Pardo, was the ex-husband of one of the Ortega daughters. He had come to the family home that night, not to celebrate the holiday with them, but to go on a deadly rampage and cause as much destruction and chaos as he possibly could. As soon as Bruce stepped into the home, still dressed in his Santa Claus suit, he began discharging his weapon. The person he fired at was the 8-year-old girl who had answered the door for him, striking her in the face. He then continued on, firing at the rest of the family, killing several people in quick succession. Panic erupted throughout the entire home as everyone scrambled, running for their lives and ducking for cover. Everyone was screaming, and children were hiding under tables and chairs, but Bruce Pardo was nowhere near finished. He had come to the home that day well prepared. With him, he carried a homemade flamethrower. He ignited the device as family members continued to scatter, and immediately, it unleashed flames that engulfed the entire home. The fire spread so quickly that it was like the entire home had been consumed by the inferno. The Ortega family members who hadn't yet managed to escape were now trapped inside the home with nowhere to go. There was no way that they could push their way through the massive wall of flames to get out, and the exits were blocked. Their only choice was to remain trapped inside as the fire quickly consumed them. Neighbors quickly noticed that the house was on fire and called the fire department, who arrived right away. Unfortunately, the damage was too great and the fire was too powerful. It had already gotten so out of control that it took 80 firemen working together for more than an hour and a half to finally put out the flames. Tragically, by that point, the home was already in ruins, and the family members who had still been trapped inside were dead, most of them burned beyond recognition. Investigators would later have to rely on medical and dental records to identify each one of the victims. After igniting that flame flower, Bruce Pardo had actually managed to escape the Ortega home, but he still sustained severe burns in the process. His plan had been to immediately flee the scene before law enforcement could get there and then try to skip town. However, because his injuries were so severe, he changed his mind. He ended up instead rushing to his brother's house, where he would later take his own life before law enforcement could catch up to him. In the wake of the tragedy, the entire community and the surviving members of the Ortega family were left absolutely devastated. 10 people were dead, including Bruce Pardo, and the majority of an entire family had been wiped out in a matter of minutes. The victims ranged in age from 17 years old to 80 years old. The oldest 2 victims were 80-year-old Papa Joe Ortega and his wife, 70-year-old Alicia Ortega. They were the head of the family, with 5 children and several grandchildren. They had been married for 53 years at the time of their attack. The next victim was the one who law enforcement believed was Bruce's main target, his ex-wife, Sylvia Ortega Pardo. Sylvia had 3 children from a previous relationship and was in the process of rebuilding her life after recently splitting up from Bruce. All signs point towards the likelihood that Bruce wanted to take revenge on Sylvia and cause her as much pain as possible. This attack was how he chose to do that. Sylvia's sister, Alicia Ortiz, who was just 46 years old, also died while celebrating the holidays with family that night. She was killed while trying to shield others from Bruce's attack with her own body. The next two victims included 49-year-old Charles Ortega and his wife, 45-year-old Sherry Ortega. Charles was one of Joe and Alice's sons, and Sherry was his wife. They were known to be dedicated and loving parents. Finally, the last victim was 17-year-old Michael Ortiz, the teenage son of Alicia Ortiz. At the time of the attack, he had been playing on his computer upstairs. While he wasn't killed by Bruce's firearm, he became trapped upstairs once the fire began. It is believed he died among the flames. His death was considered particularly tragic. Not only was he just an innocent kid at the very beginning of his life, but his death would have been particularly long and excruciating due to the intense flames. Leticia Ortega Yusufpolski was one of the few survivors of the attack. She was also considered a hero in this horrific story because she managed to escape with two of her own young children and tell the authorities the identity of the killer so they would know who they were hunting for. She was another one of Alice and Joe's daughters, and it was her 8-year-old daughter, Katrina Yusufpolski, who opened the door for Bruce, believing him to be Santa Claus. Despite being struck in the face when Bruce opened fire on her, Katrina was remarkably able to survive the attack. Tragically, though, she was left with severe injuries and even worse psychological trauma after watching her family be annihilated right in front of her. Several other extended family members were miraculously able to make it out of the home that day unharmed. They now had to try to pick up the pieces of their lives while coming to grips with the fact that the person who committed this horrific act of violence upon their family had once been their family member, too. So who exactly was Bruce Pardo? And what had ever possibly led him to want to carry out such an evil and catastrophic plan? On the surface, he seemed like a pretty ordinary guy. He was someone who often went to church and had no criminal background. But beneath the surface of his seemingly pretty happy life, his was mentally coming apart. Bruce's marriage to Sylvia Ortega had ended in divorce several months before Christmas. Sylvia was the one who had filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Bruce was still devastated by their split and completely furious when he learned that he would have to pay a large chunk of money in spousal support.
It happened at her family's home in Covina when her aunt's ex-husband, dressed as Santa Claus and armed with 4 semi-automatic weapons, began shooting before setting the home on fire, killing 9 of her family members. Yusufpolski was shot in the face.
It's not something that I needed to know all of the details to. I just knew I had to keep fighting, and I knew I would live my life to the fullest for each one of my family members and everybody affected by gun violence.
The life of Katrina Yusufpolski was understandably never the same after surviving the massacre. Because she was so young at the time this all took place, she initially still believed that it was Santa Claus himself who carried out these horrible crimes. It would take time, therapy, and the loving support of her mother for her to understand that it was not Santa, but a very evil person who did this to her family. As she became an adult, Katrina would later speak out publicly about what she experienced, became an advocate against senseless violence, and began demanding change in the laws involving weapons in the United States. I've lived through it, and I'm still living my life as best as I can. It's not stopping me. It's not instilling fear in me. I want that change. I don't want other families to go through what me and my family went through, she said. Katrina says she hopes to help other victims of senseless violence through what she has learned from her own incredible survival.
Especially with Christmas time, it's been something of light now. It's something my family continues to celebrate instead of look down upon.
The Carnation murders. It was Christmas Eve of 2007, and the Anderson family of Carnation, Washington were gathered in their family home for a night of fun and Christmas festivities. But just like what happened in the previous case, a night that should have been filled with joy and love was transformed into tragedy in just an instant. The Anderson family were very well loved in their community. Wayne and Judy Anderson were caring and devoted parents with 2 adult children, Scott and Michelle. Scott and Michelle had both moved out of the home and begun living their own lives. But unfortunately, they both chose very different paths in life. Michelle lived in a trailer on her parents' property with her boyfriend, Joseph McEnroe. Meanwhile, Scott had started a family of his own and was living a happy and fulfilling life. Over time, Michelle had become very angry and resentful towards her brother because she believed that her parents favored him over her. She also believed that her parents helped Scott out financially, more than they had ever helped her. Before long, the anger and hatred that she felt towards her family would reach a boiling point. Michelle and Joseph, both fueled by resentment and a warped sense of entitlement, decided to settle scores with her family. Armed with 2 deadly weapons, they made their way to Wayne and Judy's home on Christmas Eve.
These 2 were dissatisfied with the fact that Wayne and Judy Anderson seemed to like her brother Scott more than they liked Michelle.
Wayne and Judy were busy preparing for the holiday festivities when their daughter and her boyfriend arrived. Without hesitation, Joseph fired at Wayne, striking him in the head, and then Judy was killed shortly after. Their lives were taken in an instant, but Michelle and Joseph didn't stop there. About 45 minutes later, Scott Anderson, his wife Erica, and their 2 young children, Olivia, 5, and Nathan, 3, arrived at the house. What they walked into was a nightmare. As Scott stepped into the house, Michelle and Joseph ambushed him. Despite his brave attempt to protect his family, Scott was shot and killed. Erica, desperate to save her children, tried to shield them. Tragically, she was also murdered. In a truly chilling act, Joseph killed 5-year-old Olivia and then turned to 3-year-old Nathan, who was playing on the floor. He hesitated for a moment, but then killed the child, later claiming the boy knew what was happening. After the murders, Michelle and Joseph tried to clean up the scene, but their efforts were futile. They initially planned to flee to Canada, but paranoia set in. Instead, they decided to stay close, bizarrely driving back to the property the next day. By then, a concerned co-worker of Judy's had already alerted authorities after she failed to show up for work. Worried, she decided to go over to the home and investigate herself. That's when she opened the door, looked through, and saw several bodies lying inside.
So I opened the door farther and leaned in and yelled, "Judy, it's Linda, we're worried about you." I look down and I can see a man is laying on the ground.
911? There's been a murder. There's 3 people dead that I can see right now.
Inside?
I just came up, she works with me.
Inside a house?
Yes.
What do you see?
There's a baby and a man and a woman, and she's my best friend.
Law enforcement arrived, discovered the horrific crime scene, and immediately detained Michelle and Joseph, who had returned to the property as if nothing had happened.
At about 11 o'clock in the morning, we received word that 2 people who claimed to live on the property were out near the gravel road and were asking to be let in.
The investigation revealed that Michelle had harbored a deep resentment toward her family for years. Joseph claimed he was manipulated by Michelle, but his actions during the crime told a different story. Both were charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder.
She had a lot of anger and a lot of hatred, and she thought that the best way to act on that would be to go off and kill people. I was really her attack dog when this stuff happened. I did because I thought I had to.
During the trial, Michelle showed little remorse, though she eventually confessed. Joseph expressed regret, but blamed Michelle for orchestrating the plan. In the end, both were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Carnation murders left a small town in shock, and a community grappling with the senseless loss of 6 lives. Wayne and Judy Anderson were remembered as kind and giving people who worked hard to support their family. Scott and Erica were doting parents whose children, Olivia and Nathan, were taken far too soon. The Lawson Family Massacre. On December 25, 1929, in Germantown, North Carolina, a family's holiday turned into a chilling nightmare that still haunts the area to this day. The Lawson Family Massacre is one of the most disturbing and perplexing cases of family annihilation of all time.
Tucked away in a quiet corner of Stokes County, known as Brook Cove, you'll find a small family cemetery. Buried here are more than just the remains of those who lived and farmed this community. There are secrets here too.
The Lawson family seemed like a typical, hardworking, rural family. Charlie Lawson, the patriarch, was a farmer who had managed to buy a small plot of land for his wife Fanny and their 7 children. They weren't wealthy, but they were close, and the community viewed them as decent, hardworking people. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, Charlie did something unusual. He took the family to a professional photographer for a formal portrait. This was a rare and expensive activity for a working-class family in the 1920s. The picture shows the family, dressed in their best, but something about it feels off. There's a tension in their faces, especially in 17-year-old Marie, Charlie's oldest daughter.
It's very interesting. I think he knew he wanted to preserve his family for history. He knew what he was doing, I think.
On Christmas morning, the Lawson family was going about their usual holiday activities. Marie was baking a cake, and 2 of the younger girls, Carrie and Maybelle, were heading to their uncle's house to wish him a Merry Christmas. But as they walked past the family's tobacco barn, Charlie was waiting. Armed with a deadly weapon, Charlie fired at both girls and then bludgeoned them to make sure they were dead. He hid their bodies in the barn and returned to the house. What followed was pure carnage. Inside, Charlie shot his wife Fanny as she sat on the porch. Hearing the deadly chaos, the rest of the children, Marie, James, and Raymond, tried to hide along with their baby sister, 3-month-old Mary Lou. But Charlie found them one by one. He killed Marie first, then the 2 young boys. Finally, he took the life of his infant daughter Mary Lou, bludgeoning her to death. When the massacre was over, he carefully arranged the bodies, crossing their arms and placing stones under their heads as if preparing them for burial.
Now, man's bound to be crazy to do things like that, you know. I don't believe I could do nothing like that with my family, because you was crazy or something bad wrong.
After murdering his family, Charlie disappeared into the woods. Hours later, neighbors and relatives, alerted by the sound of a weapon going off, arrived at the Lawson home to discover the gruesome scene. As they searched for Charlie, they heard the sound of a firearm going off one time, echoing from the woods. He had taken his own life. When they found him, there was a chilling detail. Footprints in the snow showed he had been pacing around a tree for hours before shooting himself. Beside his body was a crumpled note, but its meaning remains unclear, adding another layer of mystery to this horrific event. The massacre left the community stunned. Why would a seemingly loving father murder his entire family? Over the years, several theories have emerged. Some speculate that Charlie was overwhelmed by the pressures of providing for his family during the Great Depression. But the family wasn't in serious financial debt, making this explanation less convincing. Others think that Charlie could have suffered a head injury, which led him to carry out this deadly crime. But there's not much evidence of this. Decades later, another shocking claim surfaced. Relatives suggested that Charlie had been abusing Marie and that she might have been pregnant with his child.
The crowds are gone now, but the questions that drew them here remain. Charlie Lawson may have very well taken the answers with him to his grave.
Unfortunately, with Charlie long gone, these are answers we will likely never get for sure, not unless he decides to answer them from beyond the grave. While Christmas is meant to be one of the most love-filled and happiest days of the year, these stories prove that horrific tragedies like this can happen at any time and any place. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below. Until next time, stay safe.